His job was protection, standing close to one of the most talked-about names in King's Cross, watching the crowd, watching the doors, making sure nothing ever got close enough to matter. And then, just days before one of the biggest family events his boss would ever host, he became the target himself. This wasn't a random, opportunistic attack. According to what police outlined at the time, this involved coordination, multiple people playing different roles, a getaway car arranged in advance, and that same car deliberately destroyed by fire soon after, removing exactly the kind of evidence investigators would normally rely on. For years, he'd been one of the most recognizable figures standing just outside the spotlight, close enough to one of Australia's most notorious underworld names to become part of the story himself, without ever being the headline act. That proximity gave him a certain kind of protection, right up until the night it very nearly cost him everything instead. This is the story of the man they call Tongan Sam, what it actually means to stand that close to power in Sydney's underworld, and the price that position can quietly, dangerously demand. Behind the nickname is a real person, with a real name, Semi Ngata, a man of Tongan background who, over the years, became one of the more recognizable figures connected to Sydney's underworld landscape, not because of any single dramatic headline on his own, but because of exactly who he stood beside. Ngata is best known publicly for his role as bodyguard to John Ibrahim, the King's Cross nightclub identity whose own history has been the subject of decades of media coverage, official inquiries, and, more recently, television dramatization. Standing that close to a figure with that level of public profile means Ngata's own name inevitably became attached to the same broader story, even though his role was fundamentally different from Ibrahim's own. Being a bodyguard within that specific world isn't simply a job description in the ordinary sense. It means constant physical proximity to someone who, fairly or not, has spent decades under sustained scrutiny. Someone whose associations, whose enemies, and whose reputation all come with a level of risk attached that most workplaces simply don't carry. For the person standing beside that individual, day after day, event after event, that risk doesn't stay contained to their employer alone. It extends outward, to whoever happens to be standing closest. Over time, Ngata's own public profile grew alongside that role, to the point where Australian media outlets began describing him in terms usually reserved for underworld figures in their own right, rather than simply as hired protection standing quietly in the background. He became known as one of the instantly recognizable characters connected to Sydney's organized crime reporting, his name and image appearing repeatedly across news coverage over the years, tied to a string of publicized encounters with police that kept him in the headlines independently of whatever Ibrahim himself happened to be doing at any given time. That combination, genuine proximity to one of the country's most talked-about underworld figures, paired with a public profile increasingly built around Ngata's own name, meant he occupied a genuinely unusual position. He wasn't the man the cameras were originally there for, but he'd become, in his own right, someone worth photographing, worth naming, worth following, a recognizable face standing just outside the center of the story, close enough that eventually, the story would find its way directly to him as well. By 2017, John Ibrahim's family was preparing for what was being described as a major event, a high-profile family wedding that, given the family's public profile, was always going to draw considerable attention well beyond the immediate guest list. For anyone connected to that family and to the world surrounding it, this was meant to be a moment of celebration, a rare occasion where the focus fell on family rather than on ongoing scrutiny from police or media. Instead, in the days leading up to that wedding, Semi Ngata became the target of a serious, late-night attack. According to police at the time, this wasn't a spontaneous, isolated act carried out by a single person acting alone. Investigators outlined that a gunman had been assisted by 5 accomplices, a level of coordination that immediately separates this incident from the kind of random street violence that sometimes gets loosely described in similar terms. 5 additional people, playing supporting roles, meant planning, meant logistics, meant a level of organization that doesn't happen by accident. Part of that coordination involved the getaway itself. According to what police described, those accomplices helped drive the vehicle used to leave the scene, and later set that same vehicle alight. That detail matters considerably when you understand how investigations like this actually work. A getaway car can carry an enormous amount of forensic value: fingerprints, fibers, traces connecting specific people to a specific location at a specific time. Deliberately destroying that vehicle by fire is a well-established method for removing exactly that kind of evidence, making it considerably harder for investigators to trace the vehicle, and by extension the people inside it, back to whoever was ultimately responsible. Timing here carries its own weight as well. An attack of this seriousness, involving this level of coordination, unfolding in the narrow window just before one of the biggest family occasions the Ibrahim family would host, wasn't something happening in isolation from the wider context surrounding it. Whether the timing reflected a deliberate message aimed at the family more broadly, or simply the point at which whatever planning had already been underway happened to reach its conclusion, the proximity between the attack and the wedding itself is difficult to view as pure coincidence. For Ngata personally, surviving that night meant carrying forward, in a very direct and physical way, exactly the kind of risk that comes with standing that close to a family whose name alone attracts this level of attention. And for investigators, what they were left with afterward was a scene reflecting genuine planning, genuine coordination among multiple people, and a getaway specifically designed to make sure that planning stayed as difficult to trace as possible. An attack involving a gunman, 5 accomplices, a coordinated getaway, and a deliberately destroyed vehicle is exactly the kind of case that draws serious, sustained police attention, and this incident was treated accordingly by investigators at the time. What was publicly confirmed painted a picture of an operation built around genuine planning rather than opportunity. 6 people, by the count police themselves outlined, involved in some capacity across the shooter and those supporting the escape. Cases built around this level of coordination present investigators with a genuinely difficult challenge. Unlike incidents involving a single offender acting alone, where a clear, direct line often exists between one person and one action, an attack involving multiple participants, each handling a separate piece of the operation, spreads accountability across several people simultaneously. Establishing exactly who did what, and building a case strong enough to bring each of those roles before a court, typically requires considerably more time, more resources, and more cooperation from witnesses than a more straightforward single-offender case would. The deliberate destruction of the getaway vehicle only adds to that difficulty. Fire specifically targets exactly the kind of physical evidence investigators rely on most heavily in cases like this, and its use here reflects a level of forensic awareness among those involved that isn't typical of amateur, poorly planned criminal activity. It's worth stepping back here to place this specific incident within a much wider pattern, one that extends well beyond Ngata individually. Being closely associated with a high-profile figure connected to organized crime, even in a supporting role like a bodyguard, carries genuine, well-documented risk. Rivalries, grievances, and unresolved conflicts connected to a prominent figure don't necessarily stay contained to that figure alone. They frequently extend outward, to family members, to associates, and to the people whose job is standing physically closest, watching for exactly this kind of threat, and, in doing so, sometimes becoming the target themselves rather than the shield they're meant to be. That's really the deeper pattern this specific case illustrates. Reputation and proximity, in this particular world, function almost like a double-edged asset. Standing close to power, close to someone whose name carries genuine weight, can offer certain protections: recognition, respect, association with influence. But that exact same proximity also places you directly inside the blast radius of whatever conflicts, rivalries, or unresolved tensions surround the person you're standing beside, whether or not those conflicts have anything to do with you personally at all. For Ngata, surviving this particular attack meant confirming, in the most direct way possible, something that anyone occupying that specific role within that specific world already understands on some level, that the danger surrounding a high-profile figure rarely stays contained to that figure alone, and that the people standing closest often carry a level of exposure that, from the outside, can be easy to overlook entirely. Surviving a coordinated multi-person attack is the kind of experience that, for most people, would mark a clear, defining turning point, a moment serious enough to prompt real, visible change in how someone chooses to live afterward. For Semi Ngata, based on what's been publicly documented in the years since, life appears to have continued along a broadly similar path to the one he was already on, remaining closely associated with the exact same world and the exact same role that had placed him in danger in the first place. That continuity is worth sitting with, because it says something meaningful about how deeply embedded someone can become within a particular role, particular relationships, and a particular public identity, even after that identity has already come with a genuinely serious, near-fatal cost. Whether that continuity reflects loyalty, a lack of realistic alternatives, or simply a deep, long-standing familiarity with a world he'd already spent years inside, the underlying pattern remains the same. The attack didn't appear to fundamentally redirect the trajectory of his public life. 2 years after that incident, in 2019, Ngata found himself in the headlines again, this time in connection with an entirely separate matter. He was arrested after allegedly crashing his vehicle into several parked cars in Maryland while intoxicated. It's important to be clear about what this specific incident actually represents within the broader arc of his story. A separate, unrelated legal matter, connected to alcohol and a driving offense, carrying none of the coordinated, targeted planning that defined the 2017 attack against him. Where the earlier incident placed him in the position of victim, targeted deliberately by others, this later matter placed him on the other side of a legal proceeding entirely, facing consequences connected to his own actions rather than someone else's. Taken together, these two incidents, occurring 2 years apart, paint a fuller picture of a man whose public life has been shaped by recurring encounters with the justice system, arriving from different directions and for very different reasons. One reflects the genuine danger that comes with his specific role and his specific associations. The other reflects a personal legal matter, separate from that broader underworld context entirely, though still part of the same ongoing public record that has kept his name recurring in Australian crime reporting over an extended period. Throughout this same stretch of years, Ngata appears to have maintained his recognizable public profile within that world, continuing to be identified specifically in connection with his role protecting John Ibrahim, association that, by this stage, had become as central to his public identity as any individual incident connected to his own name. He remained, in the language used by Australian media covering Sydney's underworld, one of the instantly recognizable figures within that landscape, someone whose presence at events, whose name in reporting, and whose history of police encounters kept him consistently within the public eye, even without a single defining criminal case of his own driving that attention. What emerges from this period, based entirely on what's publicly documented, isn't a clean, simple narrative of before and after, a man who survived a serious attack and either walked away from that world entirely or doubled down on it defiantly. It's something considerably more complicated, a continued presence within the exact same orbit that had already placed him in genuine danger once, alongside a separate personal legal matter that added its own chapter to an already eventful public record, all of it unfolding under a nickname that, by this point, had become inseparable from his actual identity in the eyes of the Australian public. Nearly a decade after that coordinated attack outside his boss's family wedding, Semi Ngata's story found its way back into public conversation, this time not through a police report or a court appearance, but through a screen. and a title that put his nickname front and center for a new audience entirely. A mini-documentary titled Tongan Sam, Sydney's most infamous enforcer, began circulating in early 2026, and its spread across social media platforms was, by most accounts, considerable. This wasn't a case of traditional news media revisiting an old story on a slow news day. It was a piece of content specifically built around Ngata's own history, his own nickname, his own decades-long association with one of Australia's most talked-about underworld figures, distributed through exactly the kind of platforms that can turn a relatively niche piece of crime history into something suddenly, widely discussed again. What makes this resurgence genuinely worth examining is where that renewed attention specifically landed. According to reporting on the documentary's circulation, it prompted fresh discussion, particularly within Tongan communities, both within Australia and among Tongan communities abroad. That detail matters considerably, and it's worth taking a moment to understand exactly why. For most of the public reporting around Ngata over the years, he's been framed primarily through his connection to John Ibrahim, described consistently as the bodyguard, the enforcer, the man standing beside a more famous name. That framing, while accurate as far as it goes, tends to flatten out a considerably more specific identity underneath it. Ngata isn't simply a generic figure from Sydney's underworld. He's a specific individual with a specific cultural background, and for Tongan communities watching this documentary circulate, his story likely carries a very different kind of weight than it does for a general Australian audience encountering the same headlines. Communities often engage with stories connected to their own cultural background in a considerably more personal, considerably more complicated way than outside observers typically do. There's genuine interest in seeing someone from within your own community achieve visibility and recognition, even when that visibility comes attached to a genuinely difficult, morally complex history. At the same time, there's often real discomfort and real, ongoing conversation about what that particular story represents, about the image it projects, and about the broader context surrounding it. Questions about how young people within that same community might interpret a story built around danger, notoriety, and a nickname now being marketed as documentary content for entertainment. That tension between recognition and concern, between visibility and the responsibility that comes with it, appears to be exactly what's driving the renewed conversation described in coverage of the documentary's release. It's not simply people watching a crime story unfold from a safe, comfortable distance. It's a community actively discussing what this specific story means, coming from someone who shares their own background, being told now to a considerably wider audience than it had ever reached before. This resurgence also raises a broader question worth sitting with, as this particular story comes to a close, one that extends well beyond Ngata individually. Throughout this account, from his role standing beside John Ibrahim, through the coordinated attack that very nearly ended his life, through a separate legal matter years later, to this recent wave of documentary-driven attention, Ngata has existed almost entirely in relation to someone else's story. He's the bodyguard. He's the enforcer. He's the man beside the more famous name. And yet, when you actually lay out everything publicly documented about his own life, a genuinely serious attempt on his life involving multiple coordinated participants, a separate personal legal matter, years of sustained public recognition in his own right, and now, a documentary built specifically around his own nickname and his own history, what emerges is a story with real weight entirely on its own terms, not simply a supporting character in someone else's narrative. That's worth remembering more broadly, well beyond this specific case. The people who stand physically closest to high-profile, controversial figures, the bodyguards, the associates, the people whose names appear in photographs and police reports without ever becoming the primary subject of the headline, frequently carry stories every bit as complicated, every bit as dangerous, and every bit as worth understanding on their own terms as the more famous names they're most often defined in relation to. Ngata spent years standing beside one of Australia's most talked-about underworld figures, but the attack that nearly ended his life, the legal matter that followed years later, and the documentary now bringing his own name back into public conversation all point to the same underlying truth. Proximity to fame, or to notoriety, doesn't make someone's own story any less real, any less dangerous, or any less deserving of being told in full.